everybody, it is Romania Black, and we're on episode 9 of the Apothecary Diaries, and I'm really excited because last week I thought we were just going to go on a fun little vacation romp at Maomao's home, and that's not what happened at all. I mean, it kind of was, but there was a lot more to it than that, and so now we're back to the rear palace already. We still have this firework mystery to solve. Jinshi, bless his heart, he thinks that she's had an affair with old Lee Kaku, or whatever his name is, Labrador man, and Maomao is oblivious and just playing games with him. And Gyokyo knows, Gaoshun knows, they all know, but Jinshi is just, oh my god, I feel for him, because he clearly is down for Maomao, and he just does not know how to read her properly, and I'm like, oh buddy. But I have things on that front to talk to you about that are really interesting that I have a feeling may come into play later on in this series. Maybe not. Maybe. We'll have to see. But I have a lot of comments to get through, and I want to talk a little bit about this book, The Last Eunuch in China, that I'm reading, and go from there. So let's go ahead and dive in. This may be a long introduction, but y'all can bear with me. Alex Cornejo talks about how Maomao's brothel upbringing may have had her biased to not realizing how someone without a penis could find pleasure. Yeah, we're going to talk about that with this book here in a little bit. I've not gotten to the juicy stuff yet, but in this story, Sun Yao Ting's only like 16, so we're not to the juicy stuff yet, but we will talk about that here shortly. But yeah, Maomao is so used to growing up in a brothel and everything being tied to sexual activity and men with penises, which we'll talk about with another comment, that I don't think she quite realizes how Jinshi could gather pleasure, and it's like, oh no, but he can. And I'm pretty sure when you slap that one woman back in episode 4, he probably got something out of that, but that's a good thing to note, that Maomao just is kind of oblivious to that. For as much intelligence as she has in terms of being a detective and deducing things, an apothecary, there's some things that Maomao is a little bit oblivious about, which that's fine. We can't have perfect characters. Ashley Penn noted that Gyokyo, she sees, I really liked this, that she talks about how in some of the earlier episodes we see her kind of like looking a little bit with melancholy at her daughter, and I really liked Ashley Penn pointing out that, yeah, it's probably because her daughter, as Gyokyo is realizing, is going to get caught up in the same shit that's been going on the last few episodes. She's going to be a princess consort. She probably isn't going to be able to marry for love like the couple in episode 3 did. She's going to be sold off probably to a political alliance with somebody and get married off for political gain. And maybe it'll work out where she's with somebody that will love her like the Emperor loves Gyokyo, but maybe it won't. And it's like, the fact that she realizes her daughter will probably have the same issues is just crazy. But also she talks about how with Maomao, growing up, sex has always been very transactional, meaning that she doesn't have this healthy, she just has a stereotypical concept of romance. So, that's why Jinshi can't charm her, because she's like, no, it's always transactional. And that kind of relates back to her getting the hairpin. Oh, I'm trading you this for this, but I'm going to use this transaction not for sex, but for you to take me back home to see my dad. So for her, like, flirting is not something that she's really into, because she just views it as tit for tat. You give me this, I give you that, right? And so maybe she'll discover true love through Jinshi. That's my hope. I'm rooting for Jinshi and Maomao to be a couple. I'm rooting for them to discover love with each other. We'll see what we get out of that, but I feel like Jinshi can maybe broaden her horizons to where love can take place, right? And plus, if Jinshi's a eunuch, he's a perfect example of somebody from Maomao, because he doesn't have the essential factor that she's kind of been like, about this whole time. But yeah, and then EMIHCSLLB, I loved your comment, because your comment is something that I have been concerned with other series that I'm reacting to on this channel. Won't take you very many guesses to guess which one, but this comment where they said women in this series have agency and a hand in saving themselves. They're not used as tragedy fodder for a male character to go, but that's so horribly wrong. And how dare these women be treated wrong? And then nothing happens. They move on and the arc goes on. And I'll be honest, there's other series that I've watched that I know have male main characters and are written by men, and women are used as this kind of tragedy fodder to be like, oh, this is our way of propping up the male character and making him learn a lesson. But then the women have no agency, and then they're just essentially fodder for things happening to them, and they get no resolution or no control of their own. And they don't even get like their own agency or identity, and they're just kind of shoved to the side. And I get it, you know, if you're a male writer, you may not have that experience to understand that, but it's so refreshing as a female viewer to watch this series and go, yeah, we don't just have to sit on the sidelines and wait for some guy to save us. We have agency, we have trauma, we have shit we deal with, and then we have to move on just like anybody else. And it's very refreshing. I really love that comment, so I'm glad that you said that. Anime Annie points out in episode 4 that Lady Lihua was questioning I can't read my own writing. I was so excited writing this. Was questioning her fertility from stress and from the residual effects of the makeup that she was using. That's why she wasn't sure in episode 4 if she would have any more kids. And yeah, we talked about how back in those days there was like a lack of, you know, sex ed, fertility education to know that the stress and residual effects of drugs could affect those cycles. Also, Anime Annie points out that paizuri is the term officially in Japan for the lesson that I gave you all in episode 4. If you want to know the official term for it, that's what it is. I wanted to make note a couple things in this book, mainly kind of concerning Jinshi, and I don't know if we'll go that route or you know, I was trying to think like, well, how can Mao Mao and Jinshi end up together, because he's a eunuch? How does that work? Well, back in ancient China, or at least as recent as 100 years ago in China, they talk about Sun Yao-ting says that he knew 2 eunuchs who were married before they became eunuchs. There was one who had been married before he decided to become castrated and work in the Imperial Palace, and his wife refused to get a divorce and remained married to him. Another eunuch he knew had also been married before he decided to be castrated, and she remained married to him, and he would take his earnings and go home and give them to her, and that was kind of like his way of being a breadwinner, which is crazy. But I mean, back then, it's kind of one of those things that I feel like in modern times, even everybody's like, oh, well, you have to have a family and you have to have kids. Even back in the early 1900s, there were women in China who chose to not have children because their husbands were eunuchs, and they just made that choice because they were poor and they needed the money. Or maybe they had children already, and then the men were castrated and became eunuchs. I haven't gotten that far to see if there's any cases. The book doesn't tell us if either of those eunuchs had children, but just that their wives were still married to them. So there's a good chance, hell, Jinshi's pins could be from his wife. I don't think so. I don't think he's married, but they could have been. Or maybe his wife died and they were pins. But he seems kind of nonchalant about it, so I don't know if that's the case. But I wouldn't be surprised if we got a eunuch in the story that was married and had pins from his wife or something like that, and was waiting to go back home to give them to her, or she'd passed or something like that. I'm curious if we'll ever get a plot line like that, but I thought it was well to know. On page 83 in the book, they talk about, this was just something random, the lavatories, and they said the emperor and empress did not go outdoors to relieve themselves. According to popular legend, a martial arts master assassinated one of the emperors when he was on his way to an outdoor toilet. So after that, chamber pots were installed for the imperial couple throughout the palace. The eunuchs, on the other hand, used the same toilet regardless of rank and had to pay for their own toilet paper. Separate toilets were built for male servants and palace women. The toilet for eunuch use was kept extremely clean, with incense burned all day as a deodorant. So I thought that part was interesting, but then we get into some tea, where Sun Yao-ting, who is the main eunuch in this story, was, at first, there was one instance where he stood up for himself. One of the eunuchs got mad at him and tried to like charge his account, and Sun Yao-ting gets mad and kind of beats him up, and the other eunuchs kind of like let him do it because they're like, well, he put that on your account, just stay away from him, he seems shady. But then we find out a little bit more about the dowageress that I talked to you all about previously, that originally there were two consorts. And again, we've talked in this series about the precious consort, the pure consort. Well, in here, these two sisters were the prudent consort and the precious consort. The prudent consort is Duankong, who becomes the dowager duchess afterwards. it says, it's a long story, but the prudent consort was quite attractive, and her younger sister was even more livelier. But the younger sister ends up getting like some political deals with the emperor going, and the current like Shishi, who is the head empress, the one that he's actually married to, she gets pissed off about it because she's jealous, and she also doesn't like the fact that there's political stuff being handled at the same time. So they end up basically, as they're leaving the palace one day, she essentially has the precious consort, the younger sister, murdered. She essentially says that because she said, oh, well, everybody knows that the precious consort, she drowned. And Sun Yao Ting's like, well, what's the actual story? And the actual story is that Shishi, who was the empress at the time, she said, throw her in the western well. Everyone was stupefied at her cruelty, but no one dared to object. The precious consort kept saying, have mercy, and even begged the eunuch to help her. But the eunuch wrapped her up in a rug and pushed her into the well. And then a few days later, they dug out her body and buried her. It was like, oh my gosh, this is some dark shit. But then it gets even crazier because apparently during Shishi's rule in the palace, the eunuchs were often beaten. It says that it was part of a daily routine to get beaten, and if you had been there, you would have gotten your fair share, this eunuch's telling Sun Yao Ting. He says, keep away from the office of the Palace of Justice. I'll get you a copy of the rules of punishment so you know what I'm talking about. So he gives him this booklet, which talks about what she would do. It said from another old eunuch, Sun Yao Ting learned of a method of self-protection against corporal punishment. It was an open secret, but if anyone knows, you would suffer a lot. And apparently the open secret is they'd wear a shield. They would essentially have 2 pieces of ox skin tied around their thighs and buttocks before they went on duty. So if they got beaten, it would be a cushion for the blows. But apparently this Empress Shishi, while she was reigning, being married to the emperor, she basically had a lot of eunuchs that were beaten to death. One of the cruelest punishments was called a sealing breath. They would seal the offender's mouth, eyes, nose, and ears with 7 layers of cotton paper soaked in water, and then beat him to death with clubs so he couldn't make any noise. During the 100-day reform, many eunuchs of the precious consort who had been working for her that was ended up killed by Shishi, they were put to death by this method. There were over 30 of them. In the end, the hall was scattered with corpses. And Sun Yao Ting talks about going to the Hall of Justice a little bit afterwards and finding the remnants of all this happening because it hadn't been that long ago. And there was like paddles and stuff with blood on them and like whips and stuff. It's some messed up shit going down. And this Empress Shishi, she is terrifying, but the book makes it very clear that the eunuchs were on the very bottom of the totem pole. They were on the bottom of the ladder, and up there with the emperor was like the head empress that he was married to, and then the other consorts. But it is wild. There is some dark shit in here, and I was like, oh crud. And so Sun Yao Ting, who's on the cover here, the eldest eunuch, he's learning about all of this and being like, and they're like, there are rules. If you don't follow the rules, you could die. And so it's like, it's crazy stuff, right? Right? What's interesting is that he told the interviewer that he had to wait nearly 100 years before he was okay talking about any of this, because he's like, to risk not being killed. So wild stuff. But I just think a lot of this stuff, I think of Jinshi and I think of the eunuchs like Gao Shun and them, and kind of, it's interesting to learn the circumstances in which the eunuchs went to the palace, but now knowing that a lot of them, or at least some of them that he knew, were married and they went there just to have a living is like, damn, that is a sacrifice to get there. So I'm curious, we seem to learn a little bit about Gao Shun and Jinshi as we go. I'm curious what else we're going to learn about them, but anyway, I've talked enough. We've spent nearly 15 minutes on this, but we're going to dive into the Apothecary Diaries, episode 9, and we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. Well, this episode feels like a setup episode. It feels like a setup episode for sure. Absolutely. And I can't exactly decide what route they're going to go with it, but we appear to have, like, for one, we have the whole fireworks thing, and I guess we just put that over here. We have the fireworks ordeal, and we think that we found a suspect with the firework poison, and that happens to be Lady Duo's handmaiden. Her head lady in waiting. We'll just put handmaiden for short here. but she's her head one. So not necessarily Lady Ado herself, but her head lady in waiting. I tell you what, Hong Mian is a damn saint because Hong Mian is like just great. She's doing her job. She's watching over Lady Gyokyo. Everything's great. But then you have Li Shu's, her head lady in waiting is the one that nearly like swapped the food and got her killed. And then you have this lady in waiting that's possibly tied to the poison. And then you have, I guess you have Li Hua's lady in waiting, and she's the one that nearly killed her. So Hong Mian's doing a great job. Lady Gyokyo, she can pick them good. Hong Mian's like the only head lady in waiting that's not actively trying to either kill her head concubine or inadvertently cause her demise. It's a great, great time. So we have that ordeal. Then we have Conan's, if I get his name wrong, I'll correct it here in a second, who basically had too much salt and was poisoned by it and drank to death, which they kind of are like, well, you know, was it murder or suicide? It seems like it was a murder because it was salt added to the drink, and he didn't like salty things, which would lead you to believe, but he didn't notice it as he was drinking because he lost the ability to taste. So it's like, what do we do? I thought they were going to tie the loss of taste to him smoking, maybe, because I know a lot of smokers, they slowly lose their taste over time and they keep adding salt to things to try to taste it. So I didn't know that there was a disease that would cause you to lose your taste on things other than like COVID. So that's really interesting. The more you know, right? I need Maomao with the little star going by. It says the more you know, and it's like her chugging a booze bottle. We'll talk about that. And then there's the servant girl, which the servant girl, like this part seems like it could have been wrapped up. This part here is the one that we're in the process of working on. This is like the biggest mystery because they just introduced the servant girl aspect and they don't really go anywhere with it. So I'm like, okay, are we saving that for a future episode to kind of tie in with everything? That seems to be the case. But so we need to talk about that, but we'll talk about the servant girl when we get to it. But we have the one man, the older eunuch there, who's drinking everything, and he's like, more booze. And he's like, I need more booze. And they're like, wow, he's changed a lot. And like seeing his face makes the drink taste bad. And they all kind of like chuckle about it. And they're like, oh, on that we can agree. And they're like, ha 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 ha, bro jokes. And then somebody shows up and gives him the booze that has the extra salt in it. And here's the thing. It looks like it's a woman. And it looks like their hair's pulled up. But I'm like, are they a woman in disguised as a man? Or is it, we don't know. Whoever did it has these purple eyes. The thing about it is when we see the servant girl drowning, we don't get to see the color of her eyes, which is problematic. Is it the servant girl that was dressing up and pulled their hair up and just did it incognito? I don't know. Is that the case? We're not sure. But we'll talk about the servant girl's death here in a little bit. I'm so glad that this series does not, oh my God, I'm so happy because one of my biggest pet peeves in romance scenarios is when there is a misunderstanding that does not need to be a misunderstanding. When it's a very easily explained misunderstanding and everybody knows all the intel, it's like, just tell that person. So I'm so glad that the mangaka and the author decided to be like, yes, just let Jinshi know immediately that it's all a misunderstanding. And of course he's pouting because he's like, well, she went back to see her dad and I thought that she was doing this. Like, you know, but I'm glad that he knows the truth. And Gaoshin's like, I like that Gaoshin basically told Gyokyo, I have to work with this man and we need him to be able to do things. So you're gonna need to stop laughing and explain to him. So he finds out that she's also using other men because she used the Labrador man's hairpin. And then she, of course, had Li Hua's hairpin, but Li Hua ain't leaving the palace. And then she had Gyokyo, same thing. And then she has Jinshi. But rather than use Jinshi and let him go with her for a day, she went and found another soldier to borrow his hairpin. I'm like, oh my God, girl. But here's the thing. You could also look at it this way, and we'll put Jinshi over here. And we'll put Maomao over here. My inherent knowledge of Danmai, which is only 2.5 novels, has told me a couple things about relationships like this, because Maomao basically is like if MXTX wrote a female protagonist, literally. But Jinshi, is upset that Maomao didn't pick him. Poor woe is Jinshi, and go Gaoshun's like, you've got a job to do. But then Maomao's whole thing is that she says, right? She says she doesn't think that Jinshi would find pleasure at the brothel. Which, she's probably right. He probably wouldn't find pleasure there. That's probably not up his alley. He doesn't strike me as a brothel pursuer, right? He's not into girls fawning over him. He's a masochist that likes girls spitting in his face. Doesn't seem like the brothel would probably be his thing. But from my experience reading Danmai, a lot of times the protagonist that's like, oh, well, I don't want to bring you over to that because you wouldn't like it, is also kind of subtext. And whether Maomao realizes this or not, I don't think she realizes it. She doesn't want Jinshi to go over to the other brothel and be, I know right now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, Maomao doesn't care if Jinshi flirts with other girls. That's whatever. She'd be like, whatever, it's whatever you want to do. But there's like a little subliminal thing where she doesn't want him to go over to the brothels. I think that it's there, like a little subliminal thing, and Maomao may not even be aware of it herself. But I feel like she'd try to push the brothels off on Jinshi, and Jinshi would be like, I don't want to go. And she's like, well, then what's the point of you coming with me? And he's like, I want to hang out with you. And she'd be like, ew, no. So regardless, poor Gaoshun, he's like, you have a job to do. The one known as Jinshi does not respond in such a childish way. So Gaoshun addresses Jinshi in a very weird fashion. He says, quote unquote, the one known as Jinshi, meaning that this persona is not childish, which he's being. So I'm wondering if Jinshi is another name, if that's a persona, if he's actually someone else. The one known as Jinshi does not attach himself so strongly to a toy. So he does not attach to a toy, quote unquote. And Maomao supposedly was a toy, but I don't think she is anymore. I think we've worked past that. I think it's curious how he says the one known as Jinshi. So it's like Jinshi has a persona, a face that he puts on in front of the other eunuchs, in front of everybody in the palace. Gaoshun has known him the longest. We don't know how old Gaoshun is. I don't know if I exactly want to know or not. I mean, if they're going to tell us later on, sure, don't tell me. I'll figure it out when the show tells us. But Gaoshun apparently is a little bit older than he lets on. Or the Just for Men herbal natural supplements working really, really well. But so Jinshi has this persona. Now, is Jinshi his actual name? Is he actually a eunuch? We don't know. We assume that he is, but we don't know for sure. I think it is interesting that he is different than all the other eunuchs. He is allowed to have his hair down. He's dressed in all the fancy robes. He goes throughout town. He acts in a different mannerism. He's allowed to check all the bills. I mean, granted, he has a different position than the other eunuchs. It's just interesting to be like, what is his purpose? What is his role with the emperor? Why does the emperor trust him? Why does the emperor do this with him? He doesn't seem like he's one of the higher ups, but yet he seems to have a different place in the rear palace than the others. And so I like the Gaoshun's like, it took Gokyo a lot of time to explain this misunderstanding that she was meeting with a star courtesan. And Jinshi looks like he looks a little bit better. He looks like a little wounded kitten that's like, oh, well, I mean, who knew she had such connections? And I guess that's okay. Yeah. He looks like he's so relieved to find out the misunderstanding. He's like, oh, well, who knew? And Gaoshun's over there with the sweat bead like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, what? Who knew? Who knows what image the master had in his head? I like the Gaoshun's like, oh my god, what was Jinshi thinking she was doing with these men? And I am glad, though, that that's all been cleared, because now when she goes to visit home, Jinshi knows she's not going off and having affairs with these men. She's just using them and sending them to the brothels while she goes home. And he's like, he just wants to get his work done quickly so he can go to meet her. And he looks so pleased as punch. He's like, dee, 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 dee. And then as soon as he gets there, that's when he finds out that she went home with another man That must have been quite a shock for sure. I like the Gao Shun's like, I have to deal with this. I have to deal with this man and all of this. I do like the real world kind of on the nose tie-in where they say the bureaucrats trying to pass bills that benefit them personally. I'm like, we don't have anything like that happening in our own lives. America. So yeah, I love that they kind of hit it on the nose there. And he's like, I feel sorry for my master who has to do extra work for these useless bills. So Gao Shun is personally working for Jinshi, which is interesting, which is not surprising because as the book points out, the book talks about how even the head eunuchs had eunuchs working for them. It's just interesting that the head eunuch has an older eunuch working for him. So I don't know. What if Jinshi turns out to be like the emperor's cousin or something? I mean, it could be that Jinshi is a high up noble person that chose to become a eunuch. It could be that. It could have been a punishment. We don't know his backstory yet, so we can't really tell what he is. I feel like he is either connected with nobility. He talks about being friends with Conan, who was a general. So was Jinshi in the army? He's got skills. Could be. Regardless, that's when he finds out that Conan has passed. And I like that Maomao's instantly like, oh, somebody higher up bit the dust. Maomao has a very desensitized view of death. Obviously, by the end of this episode, we know that she's not someone that's not affected by death. She very much is, but she comes at it from a very practical standpoint. But we also find out with her character that she's just kind of been desensitized with it over the years, so it just doesn't affect her. But clearly, Jinshi is affected by this. This is somebody that he, knew. She's like, maybe this is callous, but I can't sympathize with someone who I've never met or heard of. And no, honestly, Maomao comes at it from a very pragmatic way. If she doesn't know that person, she can't really empathize or connect with their deaths. And, that's kind of a mentality that if you were going to be like a mortician, or if you were going to be somebody that constantly works with death like she does, you kind of have to adopt that personality and that viewpoint, because you can't sit there and empathize with every single murder victim or it'll just eat you up, right? So you do have to kind of put up a barrier or a wall there where if she's not... Obviously, we've seen she gets really... Maomao's whole thing... I'm going to write this out here. Maomao's whole thing is that if she knows you or feels empathy and she's connected, then she gets real personally involved. I feel like Maomao understands that that's like a weakness that she has, because like with the whole thing with Lady Lihua, she got really personal when she found out that the other, head lady in waiting was poisoning her. She's like, hey dummy, what are you doing? And she got really emotional and really passionate and just bitch slapped her to hell. So Maomao kind of is self-aware of her own flaw in that sense. So she kind of has to tell herself, okay, if I don't know these people, if I don't have a connection to them, then I have to remain objective, because otherwise I'm in this position where I'm very easily dispensable. So I need to make sure that I keep my head above water, or I may find myself drowning far too quickly. She's like a man past the age of 50 who died from drinking too much. And I also think that she was kind of a little bit, not flagrant there, but I feel like she was a little bit kind of snarky in that moment of assuming. She's like, oh, well, he just drank himself to death. That's pretty common at his age. Like, I feel like from her experience in the brothels, she probably has experience with drunks that show up frequently and probably their behavior. And she's like, happens all the time. So that seems to be her attitude at the beginning of this. But what Maomao instantly notes is that she made everybody leave the room except Lady Gyokyo, Gao Shun, and her, because Jinshi wants her to investigate it. Do you really think it was the alcohol that killed him? And she's like, oh, I knew he'd ask. And Maomao's whole thing is that she knows the fine line that she is walking. She is aware that she's just a servant. She's not a concubine. She's just a lady in waiting. She's just a house servant. She's not nobility. She's not royalty. She's an apothecary, but she is very disposable. And if she says the wrong thing and ticks off the wrong people, she could get put to death. She's like, yeah. She's like, I'm very aware that I'm walking a very thin, dangerous line if it's involving poisons and people in the rear palace. She's like, if I step out of line, I'm done. And I feel like she kind of in this episode sets herself apart from Jinshi, being like, look, you're high up on the ladder and the emperor clearly gives you some special privilege. You're the one that hands out the orders. I'm the one that receives the orders. So if it comes down to it, if I step out of line, you may have to kill me. That's where we're at. And Jinshi's just like, what do I do? So we'll talk about the scene when we get to it, though, because it's a really, really good scene. But she talks about people drinking too much and how drinking too much can lead to death. But Conan, they're like, Conan could really, I thought it said rarely in the reaction. And Jinshi says he could really handle his drink. And so Maomao's like, okay, the guy's name was Conan. He was a dynamic warrior who drank entire jars of alcohol. And so they bring the drink from the party. Maomao's secret kink, I guess it's not a kink, secret enjoyment unlocked. She likes booze. Girl likes to drink, which she just got done saying it's a poison, so of course she likes to drink. Don't get this girl any cocaine or we're in trouble. So, yep, he's like, this is the jar that he drank from. And Jinshi is really affected by this. You can tell he's really upset that his friend has died. And so, of course, I like the fact that the poison and everything, they find out it's mainly just salt, which is, you know, the thing about it is salt is easily excusable. They could just say, oh, people put salt in the drink. Oops, it was an accident. Whoops. And he just drank too much of it and then ran off there. It's not as nefarious as arsenic or some other type of poisons are. I like that Maomao is aware that Jinshi is not his normal shiny self. He's like, Master Jinshi seems to be much more childish than before. And she's like, oh, it's sweet and salty. She's like, oh, this is not the booze that I like. This is not the normal sake that I want. And Jinshi's like, oh, well, he wouldn't lay a finger on rock salts or smoked meats. But then he also says he used to love spicy foods, but suddenly developed a sweet tooth one day. And I like that he's telling this very sweet story, the sentimental. He's like, oh, he used to like all these spicy foods, and now he doesn't. And Maomao's like, that'll cause diabetes. Just, girl! Like, just not sympathetic whatsoever. And Jinshi's like, stop spoiling my nostalgia with reality. These two are made for one another. They really are. And she's like, I'm just trying to drink my booze. He's like, are you having more? And she's like, from sweet to spicy. And she's like, were there salts? And he's like, yep, there are moon cakes, dried meats, and rock salt. And she's like, no, I'll be done drinking by the time you get done talking. Can you get the jar that he was drinking from? And Jinshi's like, well, it's not going to make a difference. And she's like, just go get it. And she's like, there's one other thing I want you to look into. And so, yeah, they got the report. And then she points out the salt. I like anytime she just tries the salt, Jinshi and Gaoshin are like, what if it's poison? And she's like, I'm obviously immune, so it's fine. And she says there's no poison, but it is salt. She said, you mentioned how Master Conan developed a sweet tooth. He's like, this jar contains so much salt that it left crystals behind when it dried. And too much salt can be poisonous. Given the amount that was in here, that was probably the cause. And she's like, but look at this. And she has like the report saying he lost his ability to taste salt. He seemed like a serious and skilled bureaucrat, Conan did, with a stoic personality. And they show him like working there. And then the scene with the comb and the little ball. Of course, this show has to be like, oh, by the way, we're going to make this dark as shit and talk about him losing his wife and child to an epidemic. So no big deal. And then from that day on, he just worked day in and day out. And his only forms of entertainment were drinks and sweets. So he doesn't seem to be with the other. Again, we talked about eunuchs possibly being married. I don't know if this man was a eunuch or just a general. he was dressed differently from the other eunuchs, so it's possible he could be like the Labrador man and just be a general and wasn't an actual eunuch, but I don't know. There's an illness that eliminates the sense of taste, and it can be caused by an unbalanced diet or stress. And so she's like, if he was, you know, we didn't have therapy back in those days, so she's like, if he was harboring a lot of stress about his family dying, then it could have caused him to develop this lack of taste. So then he's like, so do you think it was just an actual murder? And she's like, that's not for me to determine. She's like, nope. She's like, there was salt in the drink I had yesterday. She gives him all the clues, basically, to figure out what happened. She all but says it. And I like how she says that I'm a coward. She's like, I basically said who this was, but I couldn't say it. And I don't blame her. I don't blame Maomao for not just coming out and saying who it is. Because if she's wrong, or if that person was smart enough to cover their tracks, or find an alibi, or prove her wrong, she's the one that has to suffer for it. So I don't blame her for being like, no, unless I have proper evidence, I can't just say who I think it is. She's like, that's not going to work. Mm-mm. And then that's when she asks Jinshi, she sees that he's wearing an obsidian tassel, which is a sign of mourning. And she's like, was he special to you? And he's like, yeah, he helped me a lot when I was younger. And he seems really, in that moment, he seems very nostalgic. And Maomao's very observational. And she's like, he seems like a normal young man. I'm like, except he's insanely hot. I'm like, girl, he seems normal, right? Just normal, as he looks like the most dew-kissed and precious ever. So Conan apparently helped him when he was younger. I feel like Jinshi is somehow related to nobility. He's related to the emperor or one of the concubines or something. He's related to them somehow, because the fact of a general helping him when he's younger, Gao Shun's like working for him, it seemed, and Jinshi kind of has special privilege. It seems like Jinshi's relatively high up in all this, but he's so mysterious. And then, of course, Jinshi's like, well, here's your reward. You get booze. And she's like, oh, yes, booze. And he's like, you know, don't drink it out in the open. And, of course, he can't resist getting a little bit at her, where she's like, oh, well, thanks for the booze, but go back to work. And he's like, oh, well, should I get back to work? And she's like, yes, your bills are probably all piling up. And he's like, well, I've got this certain bill in front of me that, you know, would raise the drinking age to 20 years old. And would you want me to do that? And she's like, no, I'm not 20 yet. Don't do it. I love their back and forth. I love their banter between the two of them. And they just kind of rib and yes each other. It's great. And then that shot of Jinshi with the liquor there, like he's, you know, drinking goodbye to his friend. Interesting indeed, right? And Jinshi, of course, is very happy that he got to get a grimace out of her. Jinshi is such a fascinating character, and he's so mysterious. I cannot wait till we learn more about him. So we have the servant woman falling into the moat. Falling into the moat. Her hands don't look like they're rung red yet, unless... But no, they are rung red at that point. Like she was trying to maybe scrape herself off or keep herself from being thrown in. The question is, was she the one that poisoned the guy or not? We don't know. We just know she gets fished out of the moat. So she had bound feet, which would affect the way she walked. So you would think somebody would notice her, though, if she were in with the eunuchs and walking different. They would notice the bound feet. And she had tried, her hands were red, like she'd clawed against the stone. And there's a couple other pieces of information about her that we find out later on. But I liked that the quack doctor, he doesn't want to look at the corpse. He's like, no, he's so scared to look at it. Probably because he's never had to deal with anything like this. They probably don't have any, like, corpses like this. They probably just find somebody dead and there's nothing more to do about that. They've either been poisoned or been decapitated or whatever. We don't know. But they probably don't just show up in the moats very often. So the doctor doesn't know what to do about it. I love that Maomao's dad, who she calls her teacher, told her not to mess with corpses because it would be a gateway drug to her, like, digging up graves. And she's like, yeah, he's right. That would cause problems. I love that she has to show self-control based on what her father told her. I love it. It's great. And Jinshi makes the comment, he's like, you don't seem fazed by corpses. You don't seem to be uncomfortable around them. And she's like, I've gotten used to them. They're all over. I like that while Jinshi and her are having this very stoic, solemn conversation about corpses, all of the girls and the doctor, somebody noted in the comments, they're like, some people in the fandom think that the doctor is gay. I do think so as well, because the doctor has blush on his face. All the girls have blushes on their face. They're all like looking at Jinshi like, oh my gosh, Jinshi. And they all have the blushes, except Maomao. Maomao and the other eunuchs, no, they do not. But her and them are having this serious conversation and everybody else is like fawning over him. But she's like, the pleasure district is one street away from lawless chaos, as they discussed in episode 7 and 8. So yeah. So she's like, I'm used to this. I'm used to seeing bodies. And he's like, why can't you check corpses? And she's like, oh, my teacher said no. It's not an aversion to death. It's just humans can become medicinal ingredients. And my teacher told me that it was bad to dig up graves and desecrate bodies. So we can't do it. Do not cross that line ever. And I love that. I love when it cuts back to them. I love that Jinshi's like, oh, I see. And Gaoshun's like, oh my God. Gaoshun and Jinshi are like, good on you, Teach, for keeping her away from graves. She's like, what a rude response. I love their dynamic. So I love that Jinshi asks the doctor to do a proper autopsy, and the doctor's like, I guess. So they bring back the body with the bound feet. And in that moment, Maomao talks about how the water must have been cold. And this whole episode, Maomao is thinking like, how these people have died in these circumstances. The man's poisoned by his own alcohol. You have the face powder. You have the food poisoning that could cause her to asphyxiate. You have the woman that was in the cold water scratching herself to death before she drowned. And in that moment, Maomao's like, how would I want to go? Because I mean, you're around this all the time. It wouldn't be uncommon for your mind to kind of go to those dark places being like, how would I want to go? And we'll talk about her saying she wants Jinshi to poison her. Very poetic, very Shakespeare, right? Very Shakespearean. I want you to poison me, Romeo and Juliet style. If I'm gonna go. And I know some people would say, well, she's immune to poison, but you know, a certain type of poison, enough of it would probably kill you. You know. But she seems in that moment to be thinking about the woman being like, what an awful way to die. Drowning in a cold moat, clawing yourself to death. So the girl was a servant who was working normally yesterday. And the guard believes she climbed up on the wall and threw herself in. And this seems like such a random suicide. Like, why now? And why a random suicide? And so Maomao's like, I don't know. It seems unlikely that there are no ladders or climbing tools. But when they talk about the woman, Fuyao, and how she climbed the wall, there are protrusions that the craftsmen used. So there were steps on the side of the wall that led to the top. Which makes sense, because if you had somebody fixing the wall or repairing it, they would need to have a way to get up. So there are little ways and steps. But she does make note that it's hard for like one person alone to do it unless you were really strong. And she knows the woman had bound feet. So how did you climb up the wall that would be hard to scale with bound feet? But she makes note that the person was alive when they were thrown in the moat. So there's someone else involved. Someone else is tied to it. Someone is tied to the death. My thing is, I wonder if the person that poisoned the general, if the servant woman that ends up getting killed, if she saw it, if she saw the man put the salt into the drink and was like, I saw what you did, and she was going to go off to tell somebody, and he caught her first, there's a very good chance that he could have knocked her out. He could have drug her away. He could have like done a number of things to get rid of her and throw her over the moat. She could have been clawing to the wall trying to like hang on as he pushed her off. I feel like whatever ended up happening, she saw something she wasn't supposed to, and he got rid of her. But we don't have any way to prove that. It would be difficult for most women, especially with feet bound like a servant, to climb the wall. But occasionally you see that distinct walking style in the rear palace as well. And he's like, well, if it's not a suicide, it's fairly certain she was alive when she fell in the moat. She must have clawed at the walls trying to climb out. Suicide or murder. And that's when we have her in the flowers, and she's like, if I tell you the wrong thing, I'm dead. So I cannot be the one to make that determination. She's like, that's why we have to have proof. We have to have evidence. I can't just she's like, we can sit here and conjecture all we want all day, but if we don't have solid evidence, there's no point. And so she looks at the flowers and she's like, I would never think to take my own life, which I'm glad. Nobody should take their own lives. But she's like, I'd hate if someone killed me too. If I died, I wouldn't be able to test any more drugs or poisons. She's like, I can't Walter White it up if I'm dead, y'all. That ain't gonna work. So we got a couple images here to start this out. As she looks at they look like mulberries, or they look like mulberries, or there's a certain like weed that gives off berries like that are, I think, ironically poison themselves, which is funny. But so as she's looking, she's like, but if I were to die, how would I want to go? So then we see a couple flashes, right? And because Jinshi walks over to her being like, what are you thinking about? And she's like, about what kind of poison I would use to die. I like she's so blunt with him. I feel like she can't be blunt with a lot of people, but with Jinshi, she just finds herself instantly talking to him. And of course, Jinshi, he freaks out and he's like, what? He's like, what are you talking about? He's like, are you trying to die? Like, I like that Jinshi instantly is like, don't kill yourself. He's, caring for her so much. And she's like, no, not at all. But nobody knows when they're going to die. She's like, have you ever thought about it? And she looks at Jinshi. She's like, even if it's not something they wished for, a malicious third party can cause an undesired death. And I think that says so much about not paranoia, but about like the sad kind of like, it's opposite idealism, but this sad pessimism that Maomao has. She feels like there's constantly a third party that could come and cause your death when you least expect it. And she's like, you have to constantly be aware that that's a possibility. I mean, the girl was kidnapped and brought to this palace. It could have ended a lot worse, right? And she says, like with Master Conan, she's like, someone could try to kill us. She's like, that's the world we live in here, where we're constantly in the face of death. And I love how serious this moment is between the two of them. She's like, nobody knows when it could happen. There's no way to resist fate. She's like, if it happens, it happens. And Jinshi, of course, Jinshi looks like the type of guy that would want to resist fate. He's like, well, I wouldn't let that happen. And she's like, oh, please, you don't get to make that decision. Or at least she doesn't think he does. And the way she looks at him when he gets kind of like upset at that. So he looks away kind of grumpy about it all. And that's when she has like the flashbacks before us. And it feels like we go back in time to the beginning. I love the song that played. It was really, really good. But yeah, so we'll get this right. We have the woman, Lihua crying over her baby dying, right? And then we have this woman who looks like she's dead. Is that supposed to be Maomao's mother? Or was that Lihua when she was like about to die herself? Maybe. I think that was Lihua herself. And then we see Maomao. We don't get to see who she's looking at. Damn it. But then we see like someone above, like about to stab someone else with the knife. And then we see Li Shu. Oh, I'm assuming the person with the knife was the girl maybe trying to stab the other. Like the world, like all of this showing that the world that Maomao lives in, people are constantly looking into the face of death behind every door all the time. That's just a constant in this world that she lives in. And just like we go back to the servant girl. So yeah. And then we see it looks like her dad over someone else that is poisoned. And I don't know if that's the mom. I don't know who exactly it is, but we see her like looking away. And we see the people with, looks like pills. I feel like there's still so much we still have to get from this season. We're just scratching the surface of it now. And that's when she says, Jinshi, if you're ever tasked with executing me, can you make sure it's with poison? And he's like, what? She's like, if I made a mistake, you would be the one given the order, probably. And Gao Shun just looking at her like, girl, do you realize how much he likes you? And of course, of course she's like, did I say too much? And I'm like, girl, you don't even know that he likes you like this, girl. Also, based on the Don Mai that I have read, there is a very romantic quality to the idea that she's like, if anybody's going to kill me, it's going to be you. And I'm like, I got like Modao Zushi vibes all over again. And was just like, oh. And she's like, oh, did I say too much? And of course, she's like, sorry, it's not my place to say that. And I like Jinshi has his like fist, clenched. And she's like, oh, I don't care if it's a beheading or a hanging. And he's like, well, why are you saying all of this? And she's like, because I'm common. And she's like, my life is very easy to throw away if I just make the simple mistake. And he's like, well, I would never do such a thing to you. And she's like, oh, it's not a would or a would not. It's can or cannot. She's like, you may not want to kill me, but if you're given that order, can you say no? I feel like in that moment, she is very much establishing that there is a line between her and Jinshi. She's like, you are in a place of privilege. I am not at all. And I feel like that would be very, I feel like it's going to make Jinshi's life a lot harder. Because, and not to say that it's impossible, but I think if he ever was like, confesses to her, she's going to be like, oh, well, are you confessing so that I won't get killed? Or are you confessing to try to protect me and keep me safe? Or do you actually like me? And he's going to be like shaking her. Like, what do you think? So, but yeah, she clearly shows that there's a line between the two of them. And she's not on the same level as him. And he just kind of deflates at that. And she's like, well, I struck a nerve. I don't know Jinshi's story. If he's nobility, if he's faking it, if he's like a commoner that's rose up through the ranks. And he's so hard to read in this moment. But he obviously very much realizes that there is a difference between the two of them. And as much as he may like her and want to protect her, he doesn't get to have the final say in that, which is really sad. She's like, so I'll just excuse myself. And I'm like, girl, if only you knew how much he likes you. And that just makes this hurt so much. She kind of in that moment says like, you may have a crush on me, but we are not in the place right now for you to act on that crush. And Jinshi was starting to act on it a lot in this episode. And Maomao kind of deflated that and was like, hey, we got jobs to do. We're only in the first 9 episodes of the series. You need to slow your roll and just accept that it's going to be a slow burn. This is going to be a slow burn. And you know what? Fine. Fine. I'll take it, I guess. But yeah. She's like, the dead servant was at the garden party where the poisoning took place. Oh, I missed that part there. And they found a will with some relevant content in it, and the case was closed as a suicide. So the servant girl was at the garden party. And they just ruled it a suicide. So that makes it even more suspicious. She was at the garden party where all this stuff's going down. This won't obviously connect back in any way, shape, or form, will it? Of course not. So then Gao Shun gets his report ready, and it's been 2 months since Jinshi asked him. He's like, you took too long. And he's like, I'm sorry, I found out who it was, though. It's Fang Ming of the Garnet Pavilion, the head lady in waiting under concubine Aduo. Aduo would have some claim in wanting to get Li Shu and them out of the way, but interesting. I'm very curious to see what we're going to get next episode. Very, very curious indeed. So, but I'm really, really excited to see what we're gonna get with the next episode. Jinshi and Maomao, they're like one of my new favorite couples, but they're such a slow burn couple. But I know it's gonna be, Jinshi is so passionate and Maomao is so dispassionate, and I love that it subverts, because usually it's like the guy that's like, and the girl's like, oh my god, all these feelings, and it's the opposite now, which I'm all for. So, but I'm really excited for next week. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to wait or not. We'll just wait and see. I may have to go ahead and watch, but I'm definitely going to read more of the book before we do so. So, any case, I hope you all enjoyed this episode's reaction discussion. I'm curious to know your thoughts down below. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back very soon with more of the Apothecary Diaries. Bye!